right back.
Thank you, Wes. I'm deeply honored, and Wes McBride did not write this part. I'm deeply honored that Wes McBride and the California Gang Investigators Association invited me to speak here today. Wes mentioned that I've talked to a lot of people across the country in researching my book, and just about every gang investigator I met either knew or had heard of or had learned something from Wes McBride. I had the pleasure of meeting him really, we were talking, it was about 12 years ago when I was working with an independent television producer, and she was working on a documentary about gangs in the military, and I met Wes then, and I also met ATF supervisory agent now, Rich Mariano, who I think has left. Nothing has changed. The military said it didn't have a problem with gangs then, and it says it doesn't have a problem now. I think Barbara's documentary showed 12 years ago that it was different. The full title of my book, if you're interested, is No Boundaries, Transnational Latino Gangs and American Law Enforcement. When I talk about the book, I just call it No Boundaries, except yesterday when I was checking in, somebody asked me, what's the title of your book? And I couldn't remember any of it. It's like duh. I don't know, white coat effect. I came to this conference 3 years ago. I was hoping to get an interview with Wes, and I didn't realize how busy he was. He had told me graciously, come on out. So I got about 2 minutes. It was a very pleasant 2 minutes, and he said, look, come back when I'm not so busy, and I did. I had a very long and interesting conversation with him. Another person I actually did meet and interview in 2006 when I came out here was Bruce Reardon. Bruce is now the director of anti-gang operations for the City Attorney of Los Angeles. In 2006, when I came out here, he was an assistant United States attorney in Los Angeles, and he had just, within recent time, won a landmark federal racketeering case against the 18th Street Gang, the Columbia Little Psychos clique. They were doing extortion in the environments of MacArthur Park under the command of Frank Puppet Martinez, who was a member of the Mexican Mafia prison gang. It's been said before, and I'll say it briefly, but Wes and Bruce and Rich all represent this team effort that's necessary, Wes mentioned, from the point of view of an outsider looking at gangs and law enforcement to get at this problem. They don't agree on everything, and sometimes they disagree. I don't know of anything you can think of that Wes McBride agrees with entirely, every single item of it. He's an independent man. Well, I talked about Bruce Reardon, and when I walked into his office, something struck me. He had one of these sitting on a table in his office. I may not be the smartest lawyer in Washington, and I may not be the best journalist in America, but I figured there was a story behind this. This is a pith helmet. It's a kind of pith helmet that was worn by soldiers in the British Empire in the late 19th century, when the British Empire was in its glory, and they used to say, the sun never sets on the Union Jack, meaning that the British flag was flying somewhere in the world. Well, as I said, there is a story about this helmet and about Bruce, and it relates to you, but I'm going to put this away for now and tell that story a little bit later. I'm not a gang expert. You're the gang experts. I'm a writer. No Boundaries is not an academic work. It's not a textbook on sociology, psychology, ethnology, or criminology. It's not an encyclopedia of Latino gangs. And it's not a handbook for investigators. There are very good books like that I've read and that are available, some of them on the website of the CGIA, written by a couple of gang detectives in Orange County. William Dunn's got a fine book about the history of the gangs of Los Angeles. But what my book, No Boundaries, is, it's a work of journalism, and it's of a specific type called narrative nonfiction. It tells real stories about real people and real cases. I aimed to describe through these stories the story of the traumatic birth, the turbulent growth, and the violent criminal activity of the major transnational Latino criminal gangs, and the response of you all, American law enforcement, to those gangs. Now, whatever else No Boundaries may be or how it may be described, it's a sort of travelogue. It's a journey into an exceedingly violent an exceedingly violent land within a land. That violent land is one which most Americans, and unfortunately some in law enforcement, are only vaguely aware. They know it's out there, they don't like it, they're properly frightened by it, but they don't know the details of it and they don't understand it. And I hope to communicate through No Boundaries some of the texture of the Latino gang world. I want to take you on a tour of that land from my perspective today, and I want to talk about 5 subjects: change, carnage, culture, character, and challenge, the 5 C's. I was thinking about having 4 C's in a V, the V being violence instead of carnage. It sounded like a doo-wop group, which probably ages me. And now, ladies and gentlemen, the 4 C's in a V. Wes suggested that I talk a little bit about how I came to write No Boundaries and then get into the substance. Well, 4 years ago, I'd finished a book that Wes referenced, which I also wrote, co-authored with Barbara Newman, about a Lebanese terrorist group called Hezbollah and its operations in the United States, and that book was called Lightning Out of Lebanon. I was looking around for something else to write about, and a senior official of the Federal Bureau of Investigation in Washington told me, why don't you look at these Latino gangs, and particularly MS-13, because at that time they had ranked gang violence as number 1 on their worries about violent crime in America, and MS-13 was on the top of the list. It was no coincidence that right about that time the FBI started their MS-13 National Gang Task Force. And I was fortunate to get an extremely good public affairs representative by the name of Angela Bell, who helped me through that part of it. However, when I started looking into the subject of gangs, I was really hooked on it. I thought it was important and interesting. But there were 2 obstacles I faced. The first is there are a lot of different kinds of Latino gangs and their subsets, sometimes called cliques or cliques. They range from little organisms that belong in a single block, or for those of you who are from suburban or rural areas, maybe a little area, through the regional gangs that operate across large states or several states, to the big transnational gangs like MS-13 and the 18th Street Gang, which were both born here in Los Angeles. But it's worth noting that at every level, whether you're talking about the street gang or the gang that operates across the Western Hemisphere, all these gangs confront society with one fundamental question. And that question is, who's in charge here? Who controls this turf? Is it the legitimate government, or is it the gangsters? Well, there's no way I could write about all these gangs, so I decided to focus on MS-13 and the 18th Street Gang for 2 reasons. First, I think they both embody what people call the California gang style or the California gang culture, especially as it exists today, because they were both born here, they both developed in ways I'll talk about later. The other characteristic of this gang is that they both operate transnationally. There's some debate about how well organized they are, but they are at least loosely organized across international borders, and they conduct crime across those borders. That's where the book's title came from, No Boundaries. I also wanted to show the variety of Latino gangs and how they differ among themselves. So I researched and I wrote about the original Latin kings in Chicago. They call Chicago their motherland. And I went to Miami, Florida several times, because the natural reaction I had and many people have is Miami, big Latino city, they must have a lot of Latino gang problems. And I got some very interesting and different perspectives down there, which I write about in the book. And there are other little gangs or other Latino gangs play cameo roles throughout No Boundaries. My second big obstacle was you all, because law enforcement people are notoriously, or perhaps notorious is not the best word, but closed mouth, especially about talking to writers. Some of that's completely understandable. If you're working on a case now, you don't want to jeopardize the investigation or the prosecution. Some of you have been burned. Some of you just don't feel comfortable talking to civilians or outsiders. But I learned that an introduction from one police officer to another or one agent to another is essential, often to get doors open. Sometimes the doors aren't open, sometimes they're open and shut. But most importantly, the stories behind those doors. Over a period of time, I was able to develop a network of, I think, several score people in law enforcement, and I was able to gain enough confidence of these people that I was allowed to attend an international anti-gang conference in El Salvador in 2007. This is a conference that's held, to my knowledge, they still do it every year. The Salvadoran Civil Police and the FBI are the major sponsors of that conference, where I learned some very interesting things.